My in-laws sold my wedding gold behind my back. They never knew it was fake, and the real set was in my vault. My mother-in-law sold my wedding gold while I was at work, convinced she'd just pocketed $40,000. What she actually sold was a replica, because the real set had been sitting in a bank vault since the morning after my wedding. If you like stories where paranoia turns into protection, hit subscribe, because this one's got a twist you won't see coming. My name is Mira. I'm 29, and I grew up the daughter of a jeweler in a family that understood, better than most, that gold isn't just gold. It's insurance. It's history. It's the one thing nobody can take from you on a bad day, if you're smart enough to protect it. My grandmother, Kamala, ran our family's small jewelry shop for 35 years before my father took over, and she was the one who sat me down 2 weeks before my wedding and said, "Every bride in this family gets told the same thing. Never let anyone else hold the deed to what's yours, not even people who share your husband's blood." I laughed at the time. I thought she was being old-fashioned. I understand now she was giving me the most important piece of advice I'd ever receive. I married Arjun after a whirlwind 18-month courtship, and my parents gifted us a wedding set worth just over $40,000. A heavy gold necklace, matching earrings, and bangles, crafted by my father himself. The kind of set meant to be passed down for generations. Arjun's mother, Sunita, was warm and doting throughout the wedding planning, showering me with compliments, telling everyone at the ceremony how blessed her son was to marry into such a respected family. My best friend since childhood, Priya, met Sunita only twice before the wedding and pulled me aside the second time, uneasy. "She asked me how much your family's jewelry shop makes a year," Priya said. "Not once did she ask what you actually do for work." I brushed it off. I told myself mothers-in-law were just curious about family backgrounds. Following my grandmother's advice almost on instinct, the morning after our wedding, before we'd even left for our honeymoon, I quietly had my father commission an identical replica of the wedding set, gold-plated, visually indistinguishable to anyone without a jeweler's trained eye, right down to the exact engraving pattern. The real set went into a safety deposit box at my bank that same week. I told Arjun, gently, that I simply preferred keeping the good jewelry somewhere secure and only wearing the replica for everyday family functions. He shrugged and said it made sense. I never told Sunita any of it. The first year of marriage was warm enough. Sunita hosted family dinners, taught me her recipes, called me Beti with what felt like genuine affection. But slowly, small comments started creeping in. She'd mention, almost wistfully, how some families are more generous than others when discussing wedding gifts among her friends' daughters-in-law. She'd ask, casually, why I kept my jewelry locked away instead of wearing it properly, like a proud new bride should. I told her I simply preferred keeping it safe, and she'd purse her lips and change the subject, clearly unsatisfied with that answer. By the second year, Arjun's attention toward me had cooled in ways I couldn't quite name at first. He started deferring to Sunita on decisions that used to be ours alone, where we'd live, how we'd spend holidays, even how I should dress for family events. When I pushed back gently, he'd say I was disrespecting his mother, a phrase that started appearing in nearly every disagreement we had, regardless of what it was actually about. My own family gatherings became less frequent because Sunita always seemed to have a reason why I needed to be at her house instead, and Arjun never once pushed back on her scheduling. The first major incident happened at Arjun's cousin's engagement party. I wore the replica set, as I always did for gatherings at Sunita's house, and she loudly complimented it in front of 20 relatives before adding, pointedly, "Of course, I'm sure the real set is even more beautiful. whenever she decides we're trustworthy enough to see it. The room laughed uncomfortably. I felt my face burn, humiliated in a way that had nothing to do with jewelry and everything to do with being publicly accused of hoarding something from my own husband's family. Arjun said nothing in my defense. That night, he told me I was making things complicated by keeping the real set separate, and I apologized just to end the conversation. The calm lasted about 3 weeks before Sunita brought it up again at a different function. Each incident that followed carried the same shape. Sunita making pointed comments about trust and family generosity in front of others. Arjun staying silent, or worse, siding with her afterward, telling me privately that I needed to just let her see the real set once to keep the peace. The apologies, when they came from Arjun at all, grew shorter each time. A mumbled, "She means well," instead of any real acknowledgement of how humiliating it felt to be interrogated about my own inheritance in front of a room full of relatives. Priya watched this pattern unfold over calls and visits for nearly 2 years, telling me repeatedly that something about the whole dynamic felt engineered, calculated, not accidental. "She's not curious about the gold, Mira," Priya said one night. "She's building a case for why she should have access to it." I didn't want to believe my own mother-in-law could be so deliberate, but some quiet part of me had started keeping records anyway. Dates, comments, small details Priya encouraged me to write down, just in case. The ticking clock arrived when Arjun's father's health took a sudden downturn, requiring an expensive surgery not fully covered by insurance. Sunita began talking openly about the family needing to make sacrifices, and for the first time, she said it directly to my face. "It would mean so much if you'd consider contributing your wedding gold toward your father-in-law's treatment. Family helps family." I told her I'd think about it, uncomfortable with how quickly the conversation had moved from vague hints to a direct request, especially given that I knew, and Priya had confirmed through a mutual family friend, that Arjun's parents actually had a retirement fund more than sufficient to cover the surgery without touching my inheritance at all. The turning point came 2 weeks later. I came home from a late shift at the hospital where I work as a physical therapist and found my jewelry box in our bedroom closet slightly askew, not exactly how I'd left it. Something in my stomach went cold immediately. I checked, and the replica set, the one I kept there for everyday events, was gone. I called Arjun, who admitted, after a long, uncomfortable pause, that his mother had come by that afternoon while I was at work and asked him to let her borrow the set to show a family friend interested in appraising similar pieces. He'd let her take it without asking me first. I didn't panic the way I might have a few years earlier, before my grandmother's advice had settled so deeply into how I protected myself. I simply called Priya that night, and together we started quietly documenting everything. The comments, the request for money toward the surgery, the unauthorized removal of jewelry from our home without my consent. Priya, who by then had become a family law paralegal, told me calmly, "Let's just see what she actually does with it before we decide how to respond." 3 days later, we found out. A family friend mentioned to my mother, almost in passing at a community event, that Sunita had sold Mira's beautiful wedding set to a jeweler downtown for $38,000, telling the buyer it was an emergency sale for her husband's medical bills. My mother called me immediately, assuming the real, irreplaceable set my father had crafted was gone forever. I sat with that news for exactly 1 evening before calling my father, who laughed, actually laughed with equal parts relief and disbelief once I explained. The real set had been sitting safely in my bank vault the entire time, untouched since the morning after my wedding, exactly where my grandmother's advice had told me to keep it. The final confrontation happened at a family dinner Sunitha herself had organized, presumably to explain the emergency sale before anyone asked too many questions. I arrived wearing the real wedding set, in full, for the first time at one of her gatherings, gold catching the light exactly the way my father had designed it to. Sunitha's face went through a visible, silent collapse the moment she saw it, her eyes darting between the necklace around my neck and some internal calculation clearly falling apart in real time. I didn't raise my voice. I simply asked her, in front of the same relatives who'd once watched her humiliate me over trust, what exactly she'd sold to that downtown jeweler 3 days earlier, since the real set was clearly right here on my body. The room went dead silent. Sunitha stammered something about a misunderstanding, but Priya, sitting quietly beside me, produced a printed receipt she'd obtained from the jeweler, a family friend of her own, confirming the sale, the date, and Sunitha's signature. Arjun, finally, for the first time in years, looked genuinely stunned by his own mother rather than defensive on her behalf. The retirement fund information Priya had confirmed weeks earlier came up too, making it painfully clear the surgery money had never actually needed to come from my jewelry at all. Sunitha had simply seen an opportunity and taken it, banking on nobody ever discovering the difference between the real set and the replica. The fallout was significant. Arjun's father, learning the full truth about both the unnecessary sale and the manipulation behind it, was deeply embarrassed and insisted Sunitha return whatever remained of the $38,000, most of which she'd already begun spending on renovations for her own kitchen rather than medical bills. Arjun, forced finally to confront the pattern he'd spent years excusing, moved with me into our own apartment within 2 months, separate from his parents' influence for the first time in our marriage. Sunitha's standing within the extended family, once so carefully maintained through performed generosity and warmth, crumbled once the story spread, relatives quietly distancing themselves from a woman who'd tried to steal from her own daughter-in-law under the guise of family loyalty. I still wear that wedding set today, 4 years later, at every major family function, gold catching the light exactly the way my grandmother always said it would if I protected it properly. My grandmother passed away last year, and at her funeral, my mother told me, quietly, that Kamala had died knowing her advice had saved me from exactly the kind of betrayal she'd spent her whole life warning brides about. If this story felt like justice to you, hit subscribe, because next week, I'm telling you about the daughter-in-law who let her husband's family plan her entire retirement without knowing she'd already sold the family business out from under them 6 months earlier.